At the height of the Cold War, the United States of America and the Soviet Union faced off. It's known history, being a big part in how global politics works in our modern world. However, this would be different, as Cuba and the Soviet Union both looked to directly oppose the United States, as they felt that they had a much better chance of doing so with their given technologies.
The Soviets had sent saboteurs to areas in Montana, the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Colorado, and attempted to jam and cause malfunction with the American missile silos. As for Cuba, Fidel Castro, head of the communist regime, asked Moscow to supply him with more missiles.
The United States, however, also sent agents into Cuba, catching multiple photographs of the Russian missiles. As for Kennedy, he was notified of the reports and met with advisors, XCOM, on what to do in the situation. The advisors were leaning into invading the island, even with the potential for the situation to escalate further and abroad. The United States was also acting alone and did not notify NATO about the plan of action. The American plan was pretty simple, but would have to be effective and coordinated well. American intelligence had only revealed that Cuba had not received many missiles, but instead only had one. That was enough to reassure Kennedy, and he authorized the invasion of the island. He declared a blockade of the island, but this was to buy time. Aircraft carriers, battleships, and troops were all being mobilized. Landings were being prepared as well, near Havana, with around 50,000 United States troops being sent to Havana after the landings and 90,000 to occupy the east of the island. Operation Striking Tide would begin roughly 1 week after the blockade was prepared. With the plan in place, American aircraft began to bomb the island, and watercraft made its way to the planned landing zone just 50 miles east of Havana. Cuban troops put little to no resistance, as the defense of Havana was the greater interest. Castro received word over what happened just hours later due to setbacks and other communication issues, and Cuba tried to communicate with the USSR. However, the agents within the United States had already contacted Khrushchev and began to make their moves.
The Soviet plan was frankly simple on paper, but would have to be carried out in an effective and calculated way. The missile silos in Montana, North Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, and others were already located and reached, and the agents planted an RFR device, an improvised needles to penetrate the fuel reserves on the missiles and leak it out, setting fire to the silo and in turn lowering the capacity of the missile to launch. The result that was expected was for the fires to help ignite the bomb and make American nukes detonate on American soil.
As for Kennedy, he tried to directly dial Moscow and tried to de-escalate the situation, but Khrushchev had already decided the course of action. Across the Warsaw Pact, troops were mobilized both in major cities and along the border with West Germany and Austria. Moscow issued a statement addressing the mobilization as a response to the provocation of the West. As for other communist nations, China and North Korea were directly contacted by Moscow, telling them that they had the support of the USSR in any invasion of Taiwan or South Korea. China was also in the midst of developing nuclear weapons in Project 596, and the Russians were more than happy to deploy their own nukes on Chinese soil. It was decided that on the 31st of October, they would strike their own sets of targets. Japan was the only key threat besides the United States. However, Japan was not immune to political instability. Emperor Hirohito was still at the helm, but he was being challenged by his own band of communists. Across the nation, there are protests against the US invasion. The party in power, the LDP, was against the use of force, but as the protesters grew more violent, there was a chance of rebellion igniting. The Japanese Communist Party and Japan's Socialist Party merged to oppose the LDP and received direct funding from the USSR and China. Back to Cuba, the United States continued to advance further and further, with the Marine and Army making progress towards Havana and other locations. Castro by this point had already fled Havana for a safer location, as the risk was too elevated. Meanwhile in Moscow, Che Guevara was finishing up negotiations with the USSR, as the USSR had revealed their plans.
In the early morning hours of October 31st, 1962, the Japanese army was receiving alerts from military bases and local governors as the protests had at last turned violent. At the same time, on the Korean peninsula, Korean People Army forces crossed the border once more, bombarding Seoul with thousands of rounds of ammunition. Meanwhile, in Taiwan, the same fate was released upon them, with the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, announcing a reunification of China. In Europe, Red Army troops crossed into West Germany and Berlin, along with other Warsaw Pact troops. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was forced to issue Article 5 and the Third World War had officially begun.
As the United States continued the offensive into Cuba, the war turned something similar to Vietnam, with guerrilla warfare reigning supreme. The United Kingdom had assumed leadership of troops in Europe while waiting for the United States. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Australia took control of troops present there. In Hawaii, American troops and Filipino troops were preparing, while Japan, Korea, and Taiwan were left to fend for themselves. Meanwhile, in the Indian subcontinent, China had attacked India, having Pakistan join in on their side. China also provided aid to Vietnam to help against American soldiers already present, as China began their so-called Red Wave in Asia. As for the Russians, the offensive in Europe was not going as hoped, with Western civilians and troops putting up a fierce fight. There was also protests in Eastern Bloc nations such as Poland, Romania, and Hungary, which limited the amount of troops the Red Army could deploy to the front line. Unfortunately, on November 3rd, 1962, at 8:32 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, troops in Cuba launched a nuke towards American-occupied land. It was believed by U.S. intelligence to just be a few nukes on the island, but Cuba was being set aflame. In Taiwan, news of detonations also reached Kennedy, along with further reports of bombs all over West Germany and Austria. For Kennedy, he now faced the unfortunate situation of having to be the one to make the decision, but it was forced by this point. At precisely 8:46 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, launches were authorized. American submarines in the Pacific and Atlantic both launched whatever ICBMs they had on board. Moving back to the Americas, Cuba was just the island of Bikini, but bigger. In the United States, major cities were hit, including Miami, Atlanta, DC, New York City, Boston, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, Austin, Dallas, El Paso, Denver, Phoenix, Los Angeles, Sacramento, San Francisco, Salem, etc. As for the sabotage plan, it worked accordingly, making a huge wasteland on the states of Montana, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, and eastern Colorado. In Canada, eastern Atlantic targets were hit, as well as bases in the Arctic. By this point, it was unsure who had won, as communication broke down in the Northern Hemisphere. Entire nations laid in confusion and rubble, while the Southern Hemisphere tried to communicate with any Northern allies or even foes. Others took matters into their own hands, such as Algeria, Angola, and other nations occupied by a colonial government who promptly abandoned them and changed ways for the better, according to them. However, They would also suffer the consequences of the war as smoke went around the world, setting the stage for a global nuclear winter. No, wait, that's a nuclear holocaust. In the confusion and tension that ensued, societies and nations rose, while others collapsed, as many asked themselves, what's waiting beyond the horizon?